knowledge is there in the world in your experience? Or concretely, how often does it happen that there are less than 10 people you can think of that know about or can do something, and you'd be skeptical you can find anybody else that can? And then Hugh No asks, how can I develop a view for the future? Which I think is actually a very related question. So, Ben, would you like to start on this one, or would you like me to start?
I'll start on the first part of the question, and then I'll let you go in and start on the second part. But so way more than you would think. There's a lot of rare knowledge, and Mark and I experience this in our jobs every single day. The world is really, really dynamic now. In fact, it's probably never been more dynamic, I think, kind of by any measure. And so what we see all the time is the old conventional wisdom just ceases to be true. And, we've seen this, one of our favorite examples is just all the dot bombs that everybody made, hysterical fun of during the early 2000s, all the idiotic, ridiculous, stupid ideas that people had for the future, which were just so obviously stupid, all eventually worked. And it was a matter of, kind of the underlying, the underpinnings of the internet and other things changing to the point where those really bad ideas, like pets.com or diapers.com or any of these kinds of things, they all worked fantastically later, as the world changed. And that all was super rare knowledge, because the conventional knowledge was, of course, those things are all the stupidest things ever, and you'd have to be some kind of moron to leave your high-paying consulting job to do that. But we continually see this, and in the firm we even have kind of a rule, which is if you know too much about something, you got to kind of back off. Because, what, particularly if historically what did not work, that can be dangerous knowledge in our business, because you can miss it the next time when it actually does work. We just see it all the time. One of my kind of favorite investments that I've made was it was common knowledge in Silicon Valley that Hadoop had one big data, architecturally, that was the thing. It had one open source. It had hearts and minds, blah, blah, blah. It was going to be the thing. And I think, probably the best, for sure, one of the best investments I ever made was that wasn't true. And so it's just like a small piece of rare investing knowledge, but a big piece of rare knowledge for the entrepreneurs who invented Spark and then, later turned that into Databricks.
Yeah, Ben, do you remember... we invested in a company called Nasira early on in the life of the firm, 2009, 2010. And Ben, do you remember we shouldn't name him, but we had a meeting with I believe the CTO of one of the really big networking companies at the time in our diligence.
He literally said it was against the laws of physics. It was impossible. They had already studied it, at length at this very large, important networking company, and you could not have a central control plane in the way that Nasira proposed to do. And of course, now Nasira inside of VMware is like a $2 billion a year revenue company.
Yep. And then of course a classic instance on the consumer side, of course, is that everybody knew right up until 2004 that consumers would never put their real identities online, right? That was the one thing that would never happen.
Never. Yeah.
Right, and then of course Facebook completely blew that open. So the twist that there's a couple twists that I wanted to put on this, or aspects of this very important question that I wanted to kind of get a little deeper into. So, for those of you who think about these things, some of you will have at least read, Peter Thiel's got a famous book, 0 to 1, and he talks a lot in that book about, what he calls the secret, right? Which is kind of this idea of the rare knowledge that other people don't use. And then he has this famous question that he asks. He kind of has dinner parties where he asks this question of what is the thing that that nobody else knows? Or he asks sort of there's a sort of a related version of the question, which is, what do you believe that nobody else believes? And of course, what's interesting is those are not necessarily the same thing. And then on top of that, there's this question of okay, is the rare knowledge something that is actually not known? It's actually a piece of information that's invisible. And like, so for example, rare knowledge, let's take a hypothetical case, rare knowledge of a chemical formula that has been invented in a lab, and only the people who worked in that lab know that that formula exists, and only they know what the formula is, right? Or maybe the formula for KFC seasoning might be another example, right?
Right, exactly.
Something that's, a formula that's literally locked in the bank vault.
11 herbs and spices, but we do not know what they are.
We do not know which ones. So there's literally the rare knowledge is in the knowledge, literally like you can't get to it. And then there's this other kind of rare knowledge, which goes to the second version of Peter's question of what do you believe that nobody else believes or few other people believe, which is like the rare knowledge of something that is actually like a fact that is actually completely like basically in public view, right? It's like a thing that anybody can kind of walk up to or learn about or read like read on the internet about or like read an academic paper about or whatever it is. But it's just like people just simply don't believe it. Like they just don't buy it. Like they're not having it. They found some reason to rule it out. By the way, they're often ridiculing it. And so Ben, the question I always think about on this is like, how many of the secrets, right, or how much of the rare knowledge in the world, how much of it is literally the 11 herbs and spices that you can't go find out versus how much of it is the thing that's there in plain sight that everybody's just making fun of?
Yeah, the plain sight definitely seems much bigger. At least in our work, we see many more of the plain sight ones. One of my favorites was kind of Airbnb, which had a kind of thing that was a little bit of a secret formula, and that they kind of just discovered there was a lot more demand for renting your mattress as they started out than one would have thought, particularly if there was a big design conference in San Francisco. But the other one that was kind of really in plain sight was what was the history of hotels?
Right.
And like anybody could have known the history of hotels. Like when did hotels start? Well, they started 100 years ago. But nobody really knew that. Like, who knows that? Nobody knows that. But they studied that, after they found it out. And like, well, why did hotels come about? Why weren't they around before? And it turned out that, before that, there were inns and bed and breakfasts, but quality would vary a lot, and you couldn't really create a brand. There was no national media. There were, the way there was at the turn of the previous century, and so that national media enabled you to create a national brand and build this kind of common, known quality nationwide. But of course, once you knew that, you'd go, oh, well, now we have the internet. So, like, we don't need a brand. We can just rate every room, every, bedroom, every house, every tree house, everything. So everybody knows the quality of anything that they're staying in. And all of a sudden, you've got this amazing idea for a new kind of lodging.
Yeah, and in fact, if you think about it, like, the idea of Airbnb was kind of in the Bible, which is like, Joseph and Mary, they stay in the manger, and that worked out pretty well for them. And it's like, I always think back. It's like every little kid, at least in Western culture, is like, here's that story, right? Because it's it's right there with Christmas.
It's universally known in Western culture. Yeah,
and yet, it's like, when Airbnb started, this idea of people staying in each other's houses was just horrifying. So it was like quite literally in plain sight.
No, for sure. But I think that that's to me that's the exciting thing. Particularly if you're a young person getting into the workforce or what have you. There are all kinds of secrets running around everywhere, and then there's this. It's actually one of the great things. Maybe the only great thing about this kind of mob mentality, cancel culture thing that we have going is the conventional wisdom is so aggressive now. That if you go against it, you are likely the only one, and then you've got an amazing invention that can change the world. So it's a great time to be an entrepreneur in that sense.
Yeah, and then this goes to the second question. Why I paired the questions. The second question was, how can I develop a view for the future? And the way I think about this is there's basically two ways to develop a view for the future that flow right out of what we just talked about, right? So one is like, try to come up with ideas that nobody else has had, right? So try to come up with like a unique viewpoint of like literally new ideas. And of course, that's hard. The other is just, take...
You got to be really smart to do that.
Yes. A small number of people can do that. Most of us can't do that. But the other way to do it is, quite literally believe things that other people aren't willing to believe, right? Or equivalently, take seriously things that other people aren't willing to take seriously. And I think that's probably the most underrated approach for people who really want to have an open mind and a view of the future that actually gives them an advantage.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's true for like even small innovations, like how you organize your company or, how you run a certain kind of program. If you do the opposite of what everybody in the industry is doing, you might come across something that's much better.
Yeah. And then, that's the other thing, right? Well, the other thing that happens is revisionist history. And we've got actually the next question is about history, but,
all history is revisionist, Mark.
All history is revisionist, right? Generally, what happens, like when a new idea actually wins, right? When a new idea actually takes root and becomes conventional wisdom, sort of history gets rewritten so that everybody knew it was obvious the whole time. Interesting. Both obvious and inevitable, right?
Yes.
Right. And so, but if you were there at the time, or you actually get the true history of it, what you realize is actually that very much was not the case. The history just gets written by people who are basically covering for their own mistake. One of
the most shocking pieces of technology history on that to me is always the internet, because everybody talks about it like, of course, it was always going to be the internet. But you recall, even after Netscape started and was pretty far along and got the venture funding, and you had invented the browser and all these things, the conventional wisdom was no, it's absolutely not going to be the internet. It's going to be information superhighway, and the internet's insecure, and it's an academic network, and there's just a bunch of weirdos on it, and blah 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 blah. And now nobody would admit to that. And my favorite part of that is Bill Gates, when he wrote The Road Ahead. In the first edition, he didn't even mention the internet. He wrote a book about the future in 1995 that did not mention the internet, not once. And then he revised it, of course, and swapped the internet in everywhere where he had information superhighway. So the ultimate revisionist, the literal revisionist history on that one.
My other favorite story from that is, while we were working on the browser at Illinois, the first issue of Wired magazine came out, and I literally bought it off the news. I didn't know what it was, and I just bought it. I was like, oh, there's a magazine called Wired with this, amazing cover art, and it's stories about tech, and this is a new thing. So I bought it, and I literally took it back to my office, where I was writing code in the middle of the night, and I read through the whole thing, and internet is not mentioned. Right, it's a whole magazine about the future, and there's nothing about the internet until I finally got to the last page. The very last page, and it was a column in the very beginning. The very last page of every issue was a column by Nicholas Negroponte, who was the director of the MIT Media Lab and one of the most kind of prominent futurists, of that era. And the conceit of the column was it was an email the email address was listed as Nicholas@Internet.
Neat. That's awesome.
Which, by the way,
is that domain still available, Mark?
That would be a good email address, but because I remember thinking, I'm like, geez, okay, I guess the good news is he's noticed it. The bad news is they take it so unseriously that they can't even be bothered to fake a real email address. So I just kind of was like, okay, I guess I should go back to writing code. Okay, so on that note,
awesome.
So so the next question on that note. So Michael Angelico asks, I notice a lot of the best VCs are well versed in history. Where do you find high quality historical content? So I'll start on this one, and then Ben, see what you think. So people who have followed me or read their stuff, listened to these clubhouses in the past, probably hear me cite history a fair amount. So it's something that I like to read about and I'm pretty into. And generally when I'm trying to understand something new, kind of the first thing I try to do is kind of go back and find all the historical precedents. And I think there's a lot to learn from history. Having said that, history is really tricky to actually basically serious history is hard to find. I guess put it that way. And it's kind of the topic we've already been discussing. But basically, most history is written after the fact. Most history is written as if what unfolded was both obvious and inevitable. Most history is, written by the winners, right? Most history is kind of wedged into some sort of basically artificially simplified narrative. When you're living through kind of current events, it's shit is flying all over the place all the time. All kinds of random crazy stuff is happening. And then later on when history gets written, it just seems, it gets written as if the whole thing was like much calmer.
Calmer and more logical and inevitable, as though if one slightly different thing hadn't happened, then you would have a completely different outcome.
Yep.
Which is always the case when you're going forward in history.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really hard. And then the other is, most works of history, the work of history itself is written by somebody who's living in his or her own time and place. And the way that most people writing about history is they basically try to basically have events of the past fit into modern, let's say, presumptions and conceits around, let's say, morality, politics.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And what ends up happening is a lot of history ends up being written in a way where it's very judgmental. And I would say this has like really ramped up in the last several years, and arguably actually in the last 50 years in particular, which is basically like we moderns, like we advanced people who have reached this kind of new plateau of, let's say, political and moral perfection. We are now going to write about and discuss people in the past who, from our standpoint, are very primitive, retrograde, immoral, right? Had these, horrible beliefs, engaged in all of this terrible behavior, that by our standards is just like completely unacceptable. And so there's this very kind of judgmental aspect, that happens. And of course, people are free to draw such judgments, and people judge each other all the time in the present and in the past and so forth. And people in the past, by the way, did the exact same thing. They judged the people who came before them. So it's not to say that, of course, people don't have a right to do that, but it's like, how likely is it that you're getting an accurate portrayal of what it was actually like to live in a certain time and place and to actually be making decisions as a person in that time and place from the perspective of a morality or a politics that's 100 or 200 years later, or even 50 years later, or even 5 years later, right, is increasingly difficult.
Yeah. For sure.
Yep. And then, the lens on this that I always find useful is it's like, okay, we judge people in the past, our historians and our writers and so forth judge people in the past. The corrective that I try to apply to that, more and more is basically the reverse of that, which is like, okay, how would the people in the past judge us? Right. Yeah. So let's do it in two directions. Right. And so the mental exercise then, there is to try to get like a really actually accurate and correct reading of what it was like to be in that prior time and place. And like, if we were there and we had the education those people had, and we were in the culture those people had, and if we were in the morality that those people had, and we had the ability to kind of look forward in a crystal ball and see us in 2021 and all the stuff that we're doing, like, would we be judged well? Like when the people of the past basically say, wow, right, you guys have really advanced. You really carried things forward. You're a much better version of what we were, and I'm glad you've made all this progress. Or would they say, oh my God, right, look at what you've lost. Like look at what look at the things that you can no longer do, or like look at the pathologies of your time that you can't even see because you lack the outside reference point. And so more and more I'm interested in kind of this puzzle.
Yeah, no, that is a really interesting puzzle, and it's funny because there have been so many kind of everybody's trying to go back and reevaluate history on a moral level, kind of the. Particularly the history of the Western world. And one of the things that, if you just take any kind of instance, like, say, Christopher Columbus, now he's clearly a genocidal maniac and the worst person in the world. But, like, in his time, there were several things that made it, like, hard to evaluate, because here's a guy who's from an agricultural, relatively advanced society with government and slavery and crime and all the things that go with agriculture. Getting on a boat, thinks he's going to India, is on the boat like months longer than he expected because he didn't actually go to India. He goes to America, and then he interacts with a kind of people who are hunter-gatherers who don't have any of these things. They don't have, crime and slavery and government or any of those things. And, it is like literally a kind of a weird clash of two civilizations who don't understand each other at all. But, he's judged today completely through the eyes as if I landed, in America right now, knowing everything that I know, which is just a very different situation. And, not to say I don't know if he was a good guy or bad guy, but like he wasn't, it's really hard to judge him by our standard. And so I think that's a really insightful point you make.
Yeah, and then of course the thing that makes this actually I think important in our time is not even it's not even just how to understand history, but it's also our successors are going to judge us from the future, right?
Yes.
Right.
Well, and what's going to be maybe having employees is the worst thing in the world in the future. That could be,
Yes, exactly. Well, there's basically this is basically most people who are vegetarian or vegan will tell you the single most likely thing that people will be judged is basically, as you said, genocidal maniacs, right? 100 years from now, it will be my God, you ate animals.
Yeah, right. That's insane.
And
maybe after that, it'll be, my God, you ate vegetables. You didn't eat some kind of chemically created thing that would be much better for living things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's there. I forget the exact science of it, but basically, there's the vegetables exhibit the various kinds of reactions to being
broccoli definitely has feelings. That's right.
Sawed apart and chewed on, and it is alive. Right, exactly. Yeah. And so this is there's this great book I really like on this topic. This Chuck Klosterman wrote a while back called But What If We're Wrong? Right, and it's basically this idea encapsulated. This is what his book talks about, which is basically we're our great grandchildren 100, 200 years from now looking back at our time, and we just naturally assume, right? We just naturally assume that we have everything figured out. We just naturally assume that we have the right morality, and we have the right politics, and we have the right conclusions on what makes proper behavior. But we are going to get judged in the same way we judge, Christopher Columbus, and we're going to get judged and from a completely different outlook. And it is highly the odds that we're the first generation that's not going to be judged harshly by our descendants is very low.
Zero.
Right. Because every other generation got judged that way, and so what I translate through on that one is basically just the incredible need for sort of epistemic and moral humility in our time, which is our ability to have any sense of whether we are truly correct in all of our presumptions is just actually not that great, and maybe we shouldn't have quite so much confidence that we have everything all figured out.
Yeah, I kind of tend to agree with you on that.
Yeah. So anyway, back to the history topic. So that's kind of the lens that I try to put on it, and to kind of bring this back to something more practical. So then the mission basically to find historical material that's worth reading is basically either source material, right? And so it's basically material from people who were there at the time. And what you get from that, right, ideally, is you get a real sense of what it was actually like then. Right. And so I'll just give you an example. If you read contemporaneous accounts from people who were working in the car industry at the inception of the car industry, right? They don't know what happened in the future, right? If they're writing in 1910 or something, they don't know how the whole thing's going to unfold. And then they're in the midst of all of the details of what it took to get the car to work, and then to build car companies. And so you can get a sense from the contemporaneous accounts of what it was actually like to be in that time and place. And sort of the level of complexity involved, which was, as I said, gets sanded away in most of the histories. And then for the histories that get written later, I think the thing to do is to look for, the historians and the writers who are just really, I would say, scrupulously, honest, non-self-absorbed, non-political, non-moralistic, non-willing to judge, and, make those sort of most honest possible, kind of pass on sort of accurately representing what happened as compared to, sort of interpreting after the fact. And I will say from that standpoint, I'm having a harder and harder time reading histories written after about 1960, just in general, because I'm finding that they're so infected by the politics of the last 60 or 70 years, which have kind of been so potent, in our culture. And so, more and more I'm finding older histories, and older histories written before 1960, they have their own issues, they have their own biases and their own problems. But at least they're not our problems, right? At least they're not our biases.
Yeah.
Right.
You can see them easier because they're not built into your brain.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a little bit of then it's like a multi-layer interpretation where you're kind of judging the historian at the same time that you're trying to actually learn, from what he or she is saying. But yeah, at least it's kind of you're kind of broken out of your mold. And so, anyway, I would encourage people to not just read modern histories. I would encourage them to actually go back and read both contemporaneous accounts and history is actually written a lot earlier.
Yeah, no, it's a very useful perspective for sure. All right.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Okay, next question, changing topics. Gregory Keyes asks, is John Maynard Keynes' 15-hour work week becoming more likely due to automation? And let me just provide the context here for what this refers to. So John Maynard Keynes was kind of the was one of the leading economists of the 20th century. He's an incredibly important guy, especially in the first half of the 20th century. Very involved in policy in the West around economics through the Great Depression. He wrote this. One of the things that he wrote was he wrote this famous essay called "Economic Prospects for Our Grandchildren," this was right in the teeth of the Great Depression. So this was a very dark time, in the 1930s. And so he wrote this piece trying to kind of peer ahead 60 or 70 years and kind of say basically where is the economy going. And it's actually quite if you read it today, it's actually quite an optimistic piece. He was actually quite confident that the economy would heal. And he said, as a statement, he said it's highly likely that our grandchildren will have somewhere between 4 to 8 times the standard of living that we do. And that turned out to be right, at least, in the West. So there's a lot in there that's actually quite interesting. But one of the things he does in there is he basically says, because our grandchildren are going to have a higher level of, basically technology is going to advance, the economy is going to advance, people are going to be better off, a lot of products are going to be cheaper, there's going to be a lot more automation, and so therefore the goods and services that we, those of us in 1932, kind of believe to be important to kind of living a good life, those are going to be a lot cheaper, as a percentage of income, and so therefore people 60 or 70 years from now, may no longer choose to work 40 or 50 or 60-hour weeks. Instead, they may choose to work 15-hour weeks. And working a 15-hour week.
And the bulk of people would. He actually predicted that, most people would work 15-hour weeks, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And he basically said, and it was sort of an audacious statement at the time, he basically said, look, and he goes through this in the essay, but he says basically, there's a core set of things that people just flat out need, right? And it's housing and clothing and food and medicine. And then he said, right? And then he
that
said,
was the mistake.
Right, exactly. Well, this is the counter argument, right? Exactly. So then he said, there's all these things that people think they need, but they're not actually needs, they're wants, and it's all the sort of discretionary stuff. And he said basically that's all the stuff that will cause people in the future to work more than 15 hours a week, and maybe people in the future will choose to not make that trade-off. Milton Friedman sort of famously later on sort of counter-argued, and he said actually that whole framing is wrong, and the way he described it was human wants and needs are infinite. He sort of made an observation of human nature, which basically said basically humans are never satisfied, right? And by the way, you could view this as a critique or praise, right? But he basically said humans are never satisfied. We're on what's called the hedonic treadmill. There are always things we want that we don't have. It's the nature of basically human existence that's the case, and so therefore there's never any shortage of wants or needs. By the way, therefore, there's never any shortage of jobs to be done or industries to be created because there's always new things that people want. But because people always want things they don't have, therefore they will always basically work full work weeks, right? To be able to get get those things, and then when they have those things, they'll develop a new set of wants and needs going forward. And so anyway, so what do we think of that theory? Sitting here today, and the Keynes would be very happy that people are discussing this almost 100 years later. 90 years later, but sitting here in 2021, how would we score, the odds that the future will unfold the same or differently than the past has in this regard?
Well, I think that, the thing that Friedman was very right about is, if you look at what Keynes was saying, the things that he thought were wants became needs, right? A washing machine was a want in the 30s. Yep. It's a need now. An automobile was a want. It's a need now. These kinds of things, moved. A computer wasn't even invented, but now it's obviously a need. Everybody needs a computer. Everybody needs a computer now in their pocket. Everybody needs a CryptoPunk. Right. The need want distinction is, I think, not a real distinction, and that it doesn't matter, right? People are just as driven for their wants, Maslow's hierarchy aside, for their wants as they are for their needs, and so the kind of the driving factor that makes you work stays in place, and then people have been. So if you look at since the time he made that prediction, at that time, we were an industrial society with everybody working like a mandatory, maximum 40-hour work week. We're way over that now, at least in our industry. So it's kind of gone the other direction. It hasn't gone to 15. It's gone to like 60 or 70, in a lot of cases. There is kind of like a counter shadow existence of people who aren't working at all. And, that I think is an interesting question. And, for example, if we introduce UBI and you have some basic set of wants and needs, with zero work, does that change the equation or something like that? And I think that's a big open question.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. So my assumption is that Friedman is generally right. My assumption, to your point, is like human wants and needs are in fact infinite. New wants become new needs, and then people just can't even imagine that somebody didn't need, I don't know, whatever, a teleportation machine or whatever the next thing in the future is going to be. By the way, one of Friedman's predictions, Friedman was always asked about technological unemployment. One of the things he said, look, there's because there's infinite wants and needs, there's infinite jobs. He said, look at it this way. He said, in the future, he said, like right now, he's talking about this like in the 60s, I guess, or 70s. He said, right now, like, it's kind of a luxury good to have a therapist, right? Like, most people don't have a therapist. Most people can't afford a therapist, right? It's only kind of rich people in cities who can afford therapists. But he said, look, maybe, 100 years from now, it'll just be taken as a given that everybody needs a therapist, right? Like, everybody just has a therapist. That's just like a need that everybody has. And he said, in that case, like, you basically solved employment because you've like half the people in the world are going to be therapists.
Right. For the other half.
Right. For the other half.
And each other.
And each other. So the Sopranos had that. The therapist in Sopranos had her own therapist who would come in from time to time. So like that's my default assumption. But yeah, like I think you put your finger on kind of the big counter argument to that. The big counter argument to that is not that process will stop. It's I think the way you kind of said it is actually the outcomes will fork. And you actually see some data for this, and this is fairly disconcerting in kind of the labor data. And basically what you see is sort of, at least in the U.S., it's like the upper 20% of the sort of socioeconomic strata, the sort of upper middle class, in the U.S. And the upper middle class in the U.S. has been growing, and so this is a bigger percentage of the population. But the upper middle class in the U.S., basically works harder than ever, right? It's like, we are routinely pushing, 60, 70, in some cases 80-hour work weeks. Of course, we tend to be in these salaried jobs as opposed to these hourly jobs. And then, we have these sort of very kind of aggressive kind of expectations about our careers. And then, of course, the critique is, well, yeah, of course, these people are going to work incredibly hard because they have all the interesting jobs, right? It's like, it's an incredibly interesting job to be, a screenwriter or a computer programmer or a venture capitalist. It's not quite as interesting to be in a lot of the kind of, more normal jobs. And so you kind of have this overwork kind of happening at the high end. And, very few people have, sympathy for, richer people who work harder. Those are not sympathetic figures generally, but, right. But
if you don't like it, stop working. Like, what's your problem?
But it is a thing. Like it is a dynamic and sort of for that top 20%. And then to your point, there is this other thing. There's this other thing on the other side, and actually, the Japanese actually have this term for it called hikikomori, which I'm probably mispronouncing, but it's basically this term. It's what sometimes in the West gets referred to as the NEET, which is an acronym NEET, which is not engaged. What was it? Not employed. It's like not engaged in employment or training. Or employment, education, and training. Yeah, it's employment, education, and training. Basically, which essentially means like basically no job, and furthermore does not want a job. Right, and so the hikikomori, the Japanese version of this, is basically it's usually the teenager who even then becomes an adult and sort of stereotypically like never leaves home and like lives in the basement and like plays video games and eats Cheetos and smokes pot and just like never. What was it? There was a movie one time called Failure to Launch, and it's just basically adolescents who fail to launch. And to your point, like in a world with like more and more like social support leading up to and including UBI, in a world, by the way, of legalized drugs, in a world of basically incredibly good video games,
and increasingly good video games and increasingly good drugs, right? Like
increasingly good drugs
is pretty rough.
And by the way, like really cheap packaged foods, right? Like, the cost of calories has dropped enormously over time. And like, you can now get, you can get both, you can get a high degree, in the West, you can get a lot of both nutritious and non-nutritious food for not very much money. Was it the dollar menu at McDonald's?
It's an amazing amount of calories for $1.
Yeah. It's like, how the hell can McDonald's have this dollar menu and sell us stuff for $1? And then it's like, well, if you look at like agriculture policy in the U.S., it's like the U.S. agriculture industry produces twice as many calories as the entire U.S. population needs, like every year, because of subsidies. And so we are, there is no question that it is possible to survive in the U.S. Food-wise for not much money, put it that way. And so then you got this sort of very interesting societal question, which is if you just basically have a category of people who are just fundamentally not motivated, like, and by the way, like, is that rational? Is that irrational? Like, a lot of work isn't fun. Like, a lot of school isn't fun. Like, there's a lot of things that aren't fun. And if you've got like basically things you can do that are like actually perfectly enjoyable in the moment, right, where you don't actually have to go do all these harder things, like, it's hard to even say that some people are going to be irrational if they pursue that other path. It leads you to this very interesting sort of societal income where you have this big fork.
Yep. No, and it's worrisome in the sense that, do you end up with your social programs or incentives kind of removing people's purpose and motivation in a way that's destructive? And it's really an open question on these things.
Yeah, right.
And I think that like it's a little dangerous to presume that you know the answer, because there are clearly people who, even without that level of assistance, taking that route. So you want to be careful.
Yep, exactly. So okay, let's keep moving. Got about 20 minutes left. Okay, this one's a challenge. Mirza Murat asks, how will global geopolitical trends, and he cites as examples U.S. versus China, developments within the U.S., EU, China, Russia, world climate, etc. So global geopolitics affect technology in the long run. And then I think this maybe is a little tongue-in-cheek, or maybe not. Maybe he's just optimistic. When will technocrats unite to save the world? Which is clearly not happening right now. And then Ryan Pinsker asks a related question, which is, do you think globalism, and by this I think he means sort of true globalism of like basically universal, anything up to and including kind of world government, but even let's just say like world, some combination of world peace, world trade, on a fully global basis. Do you think globalism will ever be achieved, and if so, when? And so, Ben, these are obviously hot topics at our present moment. Why don't you start?
Yes, these are complicated questions. So I think that, one of the things that, both you and I have paid a lot of attention to is, the kind of aging and growing of governments. So, and we're familiar with this in companies, in that, as companies get older, as their founders die or kind of retire or are replaced, and get much larger, they just kind of get worse at doing everything. And there's many, many reasons for this, but like one, big things are much harder to run than little things. And, you lose this kind of, the person who had the ability to create the organization, when that person's no longer there, creating or changing the organization becomes much more difficult, and these kinds of things. And I think that's really proving true at the country level, not just at the company level. And, we're seeing our own government, the U.S. government, kind of get quite a bit less competent than at least I remember it. And maybe I remember it wrong. But, if you think about, did we learn nothing from Katrina? Because now we have another disaster in Louisiana, and our response is almost like identically bad. The COVID response, through two different administrations has been fairly wacky. we are having trouble doing the basics that a government was created to protect its citizens. That was like the original idea behind government, and we seem to be getting worse at that with Afghanistan, and just kind of increasing crime and all these kinds of things. So it does feel like our government's not working that well, and then it's also for whatever reason at odds with technology, where a lot of the solutions for scaling an organization are technological in nature, and for sure within companies that's how we do it. We use technology to be more effective as we scale, and you would think that we'd apply that to the government. Every time a new technology pops up these days, it looks like the government wants to unravel it. So that's that's a real question. But I think that so I would just say, from our perspective, from the firm's perspective, I think the first thing that we're really trying to do is to help our government both understand technology and adopt technology to solve some of these really, really hard problems that we face. Uniting and creating an Uber government and saving the world is not quite on our current radar. I think it's probably on our old partner Balaji's radar, but I think that's a different, that has a lot of other implications, potentially. And then, but why don't I stop there and let you jump in, and then we'll get to the globalism being achieved, which is also a very interesting question.
Yeah, so I think the lens I put on this is that, look, there's been a long push for a long time. If you actually go back and read, actually Hegel and then a lot of his successors, including Marx and Kojève and others, there's been this kind of big push in kind of what you might consider to be kind of the democratic West over the course of the last 200 years, and in particular since World War I. There's been this big push towards globalism broadly. And then, basically over time, incrementally closer and closer to various ideas of sort of world government, right? And in some cases, it quite literally is a push for world government. You kind of have this idea that kind of in the long run, there should be kind of this kind of global, global, sometimes it's called the world state. And then, there's the various versions of this. There's the United Nations, there was the League of Nations, which didn't work. Then there was the UN, you could argue. Well, that's worked, and then there's NATO, right? It's just sort of and then which is sort of the military version of it, and then there's the EU was this sort of very specific project in Europe after World War II to try to kind of knit Europe into sort of the equivalent of the United States over time, and so there's these kind of overt pushes to try to get to some sort of world government, and then there's just the decentralized version of it, which is basically which has sort of been the basis of U.S. foreign policy for the last 50 years or something. And actually Biden just gave a big speech at the UN where he kind of reiterated that this continues to be the policy of the U.S., which basically is you can have your, good news world, you can have your country, and you can have your government, as long as it basically conforms to our values, right? So as long as it's democratic, right? As long as it's basically, oriented towards free trade, as long as it's, basically doesn't try to have the wrong kind of weapons. What's that? Inclusive. Yeah. Basically, he put a double underline, just and again, this is not to judge this, but just to state, he stated it. He double underlined in his speech, basically the U.S. foreign policy expectation now firmly includes not only women's rights but also LGBT rights, and so therefore you are what they refer to as a member in good standing of the global community if you have basically the American equivalent of gender rights and LGBT rights, and basically the message being if you don't that's a problem. And the EU has a sort of a very similar kind of position as well. And so that's the decentralized version, which is just we're going to have a moral code and an ethical code and a set of governance structures and presumptions. And you can you Mr. Country XYZ that's not the U.S. or in Europe, you can either go along with that and be friends of ours, or fundamentally you can be not. And of course, for the last 50 years, that's been a pretty compelling pitch, right, to a lot of countries. And, a lot of that is just because a lot of countries had very bad runs as, tyrannies of various kinds. And so, democracy was, in a lot of cases a big improvement. And then a lot of countries in the past were, what was called autarkies. They were, they didn't have free trade. they had very low standards of living, and so generally, as they've implemented more free trade, standards of living have risen. And a lot of countries had horrible records on women's rights, and so now that's improving in a lot of places. And so there's a lot to like about this model of progress. It all vectors you in this direction of basically, though, sort of a global model of government and a global model of governance. And then, I think basically the big question for the next 20 or 30 years is what's the force of either that overt or covert move, push to global government versus basically backlash, right? At what point to which countries basically just say, enough. Right, we're not the U.S. We don't need to be exactly like the U.S. We have our own views. We have our own culture. We have our own this. We have our own that. And we're not on board with this. And probably the single biggest recent news on this is China. China's issued this series of extremely interesting decrees recently, which is quite the two that are the most amazing to me. So one is they basically said that kids in China, people below the age of 18 in China now, can only play video games 3 hours a week. And by the way, only on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights from 8 to 9 p.m. Right?
Yeah.
And so
it's very strict.
Very strict, and it's basically we're as we just talked about the hikikomori phenomenon. They're basically saying, look, kids in China are not going to get to just sit and play video games all the time, right? Which is a cultural statement, a directive that for sure we don't have in the U.S. And then the other one that just is amazing from a Western perspective is they literally put out a ruling. Basically, they banned effeminate men from television. So they banned basically the portrayal of men who don't have stereotypically masculine, affect and style from Chinese television, which is which I just find, it's amazing just on the surface, but it's just also amazing, which is of course that's just an inconceivable idea in the U.S. I mean, you can't even find an argument against in the U.S. because the whole idea is just inconceivable. Right. And so, you've got the Chinese regime that basically more and more is signaling no, enough is enough. We're just not, we've let a lot of American movies in. We've let a lot of American culture in. We've let a lot of American technology in. And we're going to start drawing lines here. And so, there's the prospect of a very real cultural backlash, in that country, against sort of what you might, describe as American values. And I guess I'd say, I don't know how to forecast, it may just be that, basically the Western kind of cultural steamroller is so intense that it's just going to roll over everything. And, 30 years from now, we're going to have much more of this sort of world state, in effect, if not in reality. Or it could be that actually the backlash is going to grow a lot. And a lot of other countries are just going to be basically pound sand. We're going to have our own culture and our own way of doing things.
Yeah, the country you didn't mention, which is in the news a lot on this, is Afghanistan, where we're demanding that the Taliban be inclusive, and they're like, "Yeah, we'll be inclusive as long as everybody wears a burqa." It is. I think we sometimes, with that idea, really underestimate the profound cultural, evolutionary cultural differences, anthropological cultural differences across countries and across the world. And, we tried to make, as the great George W. Bush kind of idea was to, turn Iraq into a democracy. And that didn't work out that well. And I think that, a lot of the things that we take for granted in the U.S. are endemic to, the psychology of our citizens, which comes from the culture that we've been living in for a long time. But, to your point, Mark, if you look at within the U.S., we're having trouble harmonizing our culture and our values and, what's okay and what's not okay. We're probably more divided on the issues that you've talked about now than, we've been in a long, long time. So the idea that we can harmonize the world to our culture that we ourselves don't really quite adhere to seems like we're a far way off on that, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, exactly your point. If you just think in terms of U.S. politics, right? There were the neoconservatives, right? As you said, in the Bush era, the neoconservatives basically it was a right-wing movement to basically reform world politics and morality along basically an American conservative lens. And then now there's this sort of whatever you want to call the sort of let's say liberal, left, progressive, woke kind of lens. the Biden administration lens, they basically have sort of American left-wing politics and morality, basically be spread around the world. And so, there's some over. I mean, the thing that they both have in common, right? The thing that neoconservatives and kind of the sort of internationalist progressives have in common is, the firm conviction that the U.S. is in a position to be able to basically dictate morality for the world.
Yep, that's it. So the religious right versus the religious left in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. And so they have that in common. But to your point, they have very different ideas of what that means in practice. And so, we're a little schizophrenic on those topics.
Yeah, I feel like we probably need to get our own house in order before we're able to export it, massively.
But what would be the fun in that?
Yeah, what would be the fun in that, exactly.
So, all right, let's close on a practical. This has been a very fun theoretical conversation. Let's close on a practical topic. Ben, I'll bounce this one to you. So, Darpan asks, in the context of running a startup, how to know about things that you don't even know you need to know. For example, if an 18-year-old founder didn't know that they even needed to do marketing.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because it's like, how do you know what you don't know? I always think, if you're kind of very new to the whole thing, having conversations with people who are in the industry, who are particularly in jobs that you don't understand, is extremely valuable. So, for example, if you're an 18-year-old founder, you don't know that you need marketing, and then if you start to understand that you do need marketing, you don't know what that is, and then if you know what that is and you know you need it, you don't know who the right person to run it is, because you've never run marketing. You didn't even know what it was like 2 weeks ago. So how do you go up that learning curve? And, I find like one of the best ways is to meet those people doing those jobs and just ask them, kind of all of the kind of really seemingly dumb questions, which is, okay, what is marketing? What are the components of it? How do you, what's the difference between somebody who's good at marketing and somebody who's great at marketing? How do you know that? How would you test for it in an interview? How do you just all those kinds of basic things that you don't know the answer to, and don't be embarrassed about asking them, because people actually like to answer questions like that. And I find, I ask marketing executive candidates this sometimes, and they don't even know what marketing is. Mm-hmm. So, these are not dumb questions. They're really, really good questions. And I think that if you're going to go understand business, that's one way to do it. I mean, there's obviously many things to read. There are, of course, far more, the ratio of bad business books to good business books is very high. So make sure you get recommendations from smart friends on it. But, that's kind of, some combination of reading the good business books and talking to people in the field is probably the best way to start to build a picture and a model of what a company might look like. And of course, even what that is evolving. So, the way crypto companies market is very different than the way, say, internet consumer companies market. When you have a coin, it's a different kind of strategy than if you're using SEO.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So this is the problem. This is sort of the tension, right? Which is the way that you learn is by either talking or reading, sort of from people who already understand, right? But the problem is things do change.
Yes.
And so, another great example, right, is there's an entire generation of sort of tech sales leaders who would tell you that top-down sales is the only way. They practically there's an old kind of article of faith, right, in sort of tech go-to-market, which basically is the revenues can all come from big companies because big companies have all the money, and then big companies need to be sold to, and so therefore you need a top-down sales force. And of course, there are lots of new tech businesses now that have taken a very different approach, with a different bottoms up.
No, most of this tech, so right. Product-led market, product-led, we call it,
Yeah, exactly. And so there's and this is what we've noticed a lot on the ground, I think, which is there's a fine line between I am an 18-year-old or 25-year-old founder, and I don't want to do top-down sales, and I also don't want to do marketing, and so therefore I'm going to do nothing, and then I'm going to fail because I don't understand it. And to the original question, I didn't even know that I needed to know that. I just thought if I built the product, that would be fine. versus the 25-year-old founder who's like, you know what, like there used to be an old way of doing it. It's not the old way. It's not the right way to do it anymore. There's this new way of doing it. It doesn't look like sales or marketing looked like before. It looks different. And we have like a whole new take on this. And so we're going to do things that actually don't even look like sales and marketing. We're going to have like a developer program, right? And that's going to be our go-to-market. And you know, some of those people in the last 10 years, some of those founders have been very wrong and have like really like, you know, in some cases lost their companies over being wrong about this. And some of them have been really right. And, you know, they've built monster companies using entirely new techniques. And so there is some real tension here on how much of this you can actually learn.
You know, I agree with that, and I think that's a really great point, that you don't want to get the method, you want to get the concepts, right? So, yeah, and look, a company is pretty simple. It's like there's a product or an offering, and then there's how you inform and, you know, potential customers about that and how you get them to buy it. And those are the two main components of any company. And so you do want to kind of conceptualize how people have done it with various kinds of products and understand what they've done, and then, you know, kind of come up with your own ideas for your own company, as opposed to just straight adopt something that somebody else has done.
Good. All right. We are right at 6 o'clock, so we'll call it here. Benjamin, thank you, and to the entire audience and everybody who asked questions. Thank you, and we will see you again very shortly.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Okay. All right. See you all soon.